There are 50 million Americans currently counting on a number that doesn't exist. Not because anyone lied to them, not because of fraud, because of math that was done decades ago, based on assumptions that quietly stopped being true, and nobody updated the promise. This isn't a future crisis. This isn't something that might happen in 2050 if we're unlucky. This is already happening. Right now, quietly, in city budgets and state pension funds and corporate retirement plans across the country. And the reason you haven't heard about it is the same reason nobody covered the Japanese bond market until it was already moving global interest rates. It's boring. It's slow. It doesn't have a villain you can put on a thumbnail. But if you are relying on a pension, or you know someone who is, what you're about to learn will change how you think about retirement security for the rest of your life.
And here's the part almost nobody understands. The crisis isn't about whether the money runs out. It's about a number that was wrong from the beginning. We'll get to exactly what that number is, and once you see it, you'll never look at a pension promise the same way again. To understand the crisis, you have to understand the promise. A traditional pension, what's called a defined benefit plan, works on a simple premise. You work for an employer, usually a government or a large corporation, for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. In exchange, when you retire, they pay you a guaranteed amount every month for the rest of your life. Not a suggestion, not an estimate, a guarantee. To fund that guarantee, your employer sets aside money throughout your career into a pension fund. That fund gets invested in stocks, bonds, real estate, and the returns on those investments are supposed to grow the fund enough to pay out every promised pension for every retiree for decades. Here's the critical piece. Pension funds make a specific assumption when they calculate how much money they need today. They assume a future rate of return on their investments, typically somewhere between 6.5% and 8% per year, every year, for the next 20 to 30 years. That assumption is called the discount rate, and it is the single most important number in the entire pension system. If the assumption is accurate, the math works. The fund grows as projected. The promises get paid. If the assumption is wrong, even by a percentage point or two, the entire structure becomes underfunded, quietly, invisibly, for years before anyone notices. And for the last 2 decades, that assumption has been wrong almost everywhere. In the 1990s and early 2000s, an 8% annual return assumption wasn't unreasonable. Interest rates were higher, bond yields were higher, stock market returns over multi-decade periods supported that kind of assumption. Then 2008 happened. Then a decade of near zero interest rates happened. Then bond yields, which form the backbone of every pension fund's safe portion of its portfolio, collapsed to historic lows. A pension fund that needed 8% annual returns to stay funded was suddenly living in a world where government bonds yielded 2%, sometimes less. So what did pension funds do? They had 2 choices. Option 1, lower the assumed rate of return to match reality. This is the honest choice, but it comes with a brutal consequence. If you lower the assumed return, you have to admit the fund needs dramatically more money today to meet future obligations. For a government pension fund, that means either raising taxes significantly or cutting other services. For a corporate pension, it means a massive balance sheet hit. Option 2, keep the optimistic assumption and chase higher returns through riskier investments. Private equity, hedge funds, alternative assets, hoping to make up the difference. Most pension funds, particularly public ones, chose option 2. Not because the people running them were reckless, because option 1 was politically and financially impossible to admit. And so, for the last 15 years, pension funds across the country have been carrying assumptions that don't match the world they're actually investing in. Here's what that gap actually looks like in numbers. According to multiple independent actuarial analyses, U.S. state and local government pension funds are collectively underfunded by an amount that, depending on how conservatively you calculate the discount rate, ranges from $1.5 trillion using optimistic assumptions to over $5 trillion using more realistic market-based assumptions. That gap between what's been promised and what's actually been set aside doesn't show up as a single dramatic headline. It shows up as 1,000 quiet individual decisions made by city councils and state legislatures every single year. A city that needs to make a larger pension contribution this year either raises property taxes, cuts a public service, or delays road maintenance.
benefits. None of these decisions make national news. Each one, individually, looks like a local budget story, but collectively, they are the visible symptoms of an invisible structural problem. And it's not isolated to government pensions. What's left of them, since most private companies have already shifted new employees to 401k style plans, carry similar underfunding issues. The companies that still maintain old-style pension plans are largely older, legacy industries. Airlines, auto manufacturers, steel, some unionized sectors. Several major corporate pension failures already happened in the early 2000s. United Airlines, several major steel companies. When those plans collapsed, the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, a government insurance fund for pensions, stepped in to cover a portion of the promised benefits. But the PBGC itself operates on the same kind of actuarial assumptions as the funds it's backing up. It is not, structurally, designed to absorb a wave of failures happening at the same time. This is where the story gets interesting, not financially, but in terms of why it stays invisible. A pension crisis doesn't look like a stock market crash. There's no single day where a number drops 10% and every news outlet runs the same headline. Instead, it looks like a city in Illinois quietly raising property taxes for the third year in a row. It looks like a state pension board adjusting its discount rate assumption by 0.5 percentage point in a board meeting that nobody outside the actuarial profession attends. It looks like a corporate pension freeze, new employees no longer eligible, buried in a quarterly earnings report. None of these moments are dramatic enough to trend. None of them have a villain. The people managing these funds aren't committing fraud. They're working within a system that made promises decades ago, based on assumptions that the world has since outgrown. And the people who will be most affected, current retirees and people close to retirement, are the least likely to see it coming, because pension checks have continued arriving on schedule for years, even as the underlying funding gap widened. The system doesn't fail loudly. It erodes quietly, until a specific city, a specific state, or a specific corporate plan reaches a point where it simply cannot make the numbers work anymore. And at that point, the options are limited. Benefit cuts, which are often legally complicated and politically explosive, or a bailout, which shifts the cost to taxpayers who never signed up for the promise in the first place. If you're thinking this doesn't apply to you because you don't have a pension, that's actually part of the problem, not a reason for relief. The shift away from traditional pensions toward 401k and individual retirement accounts means an entire generation is now responsible for managing their own retirement investment risk without a guaranteed income floor. That shift happened specifically because employers realized how expensive and unpredictable pension promises had become. So if you're under 45, you likely don't have a pension at all. You have a 401k, and your retirement security depends entirely on what you contribute and how the market performs over your working life, with no guarantee attached. If you're over 55 and counting on a pension, particularly a public sector pension as a teacher, firefighter, police officer, or government employee, this is directly relevant to you. The funding status of your specific plan matters enormously, and most people have never checked it. If you're a taxpayer in a city or state with a significantly underfunded pension system, you are already indirectly paying for this through property taxes that rise faster than inflation, through service cuts that happen for budget reasons, through a slow erosion of public services that gets attributed to a dozen different causes when one of the underlying causes is consistently the same. And if you work for a company that still offers a traditional pension, it's worth understanding whether that pension is fully funded, partially funded, or already frozen for new employees, because that status tells you how seriously to weight that pension in your own retirement planning. Here's the number I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the number that was wrong from the start. It's not the total dollar amount of the shortfall, it's the discount rate itself. For decades, pension funds assumed they could reliably earn 7% to 8% per year, every year, indefinitely, regardless of what was happening in the broader economy. That assumption treated investment returns like a fixed mathematical constant, when in reality, returns are variable, cyclical, and deeply dependent on the interest rate environment at any given time. Treating a variable as if it were a constant is the single structural flaw underneath the entire pension funding crisis. Every other number, the trillion-dollar shortfalls, the city budget crises, the corporate pension freezes, flows downstream from that one mistaken assumption. And the reason this matters beyond pensions specifically is that the same flawed thinking shows up everywhere in long-term financial planning. Social security projections, insurance company actuarial tables, personal retirement calculators that assume a steady 7% annual return forever. The world doesn't deliver steady, guaranteed returns. It delivers cycles. And any financial system, public or private, built on the assumption of permanent, guaranteed growth is building on a foundation that will eventually be tested by reality. Pension funds are simply the largest, most visible example of what happens when that test arrives.
This story will never trend. It doesn't have a clear villain. It doesn't resolve in a single news cycle. It requires understanding actuarial assumptions, municipal budgets, and decades-long investment cycles simultaneously, and connecting them to whether your grandmother's pension check arrives on time in 15 years. That's not viral content. That's the slow, structural reality underneath the financial system most people never look at directly. But it's already happening in city council meetings, in actuarial reports, in the quiet adjustments to discount rate assumptions that nobody outside the profession ever reads. If you want to understand the financial forces that actually shape your future, not the loud headlines, but the slow, structural shifts underneath them, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the real risks were never the ones that trend. They're the ones that quietly compound in plain sight for decades until the day they can't be ignored anymore.